Okay. Our last speaker of the day is Dr. Jason Gibb, and I will read his bio that he sent. He's an associate professor in the Department of Entomology at the University of Manitoba. He completed his PhD at York University studying taxonomy of sweat bees. He was then a postdoctoral researcher at Cornell University studying apple pollination and sweat bee evolution. He was then a research associate at Michigan State University conducting research on high bush blueberry pollination. His current research focuses on bee taxonomy, phylogenomics, and the effective landscape management on beneficial insects. He's published over 100 scientific papers on various aspects of bee taxonomy, evolution, and ecology. And I just need to mention, in honor of Jason, I wore my bee shirt today, and it's actually made out of recycled materials, so I knew that John would really like that, and probably so would Jason. So it's a very green shirt in more ways than one. So with that, Jason, the floor is yours.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm primarily an insect taxonomist. And so the focus of my research is really on the bees. But John Gavoski asked me to talk a little bit about how bees sort of affect crops in the prairies. So I'm going to do my best with that. So some of the research I conducted when I was at Michigan State had to do with this idea of integrated crop pollination, which is very much in line with integrated pest management. It's this sort of an idea of sort of integrating different approaches, different pollinators in order to sort of maximize the sustainability and the productivity of pollination. So managing your pesticides, using sort of different practices, habitat enhancement, so specific application of floral resources in the landscape to sort of support pollinators. And then sort of integrating your typical managed honeybee with other sort of alternative managed pollinators, and also taking the advantage of all the wild bees that are present in the landscape. So this is how I sort of think about it. So I've centered bee diversity in the middle because that's what interests me the most. And that's the primary area that I do research on. But then also sort of looking at some of the drivers that affect those bees, and then sort of the downstream effects that has on pollination services. Whether or not that's sort of wildflower pollination, sort of ecological benefits that wild bees have, or the sort of direct sort of benefits on crop pollination. And it's very complicated, as you can imagine. I'm going to talk mostly about bees, but I would be it would be wrong to ignore all the other pollinators out there. So beetles, wasps, and this girl here, this is a hoverfly, a syrphid fly, and they have predatory larvae, so they're beneficial in crops because they're eating lots of aphids and things like that. But they are also important pollinators. So there's lots of important pollinators out there besides just bees. Most bees are not anything like a honeybee. A honeybee is an introduced species, so it was brought over by Europeans in the 1600s. So these are both bees on an onion flower. There's a honeybee, there's the larger one, and then the sweat bee is a little small species in front. And so these are really small, often get ignored. They get the name sweat bees because they land on your arm and drink your sweat on hot days, but they're incredibly abundant. So I guarantee you have sweat bees nesting in your lawn if you have a lawn, and they're actually one of the most disturbance tolerant sort of bees. So if you sweep through a canola field, if you find any bees, you're likely to find sweat bees. So just a few things. So these are all, most bees don't sting or aren't likely to sting. So these are my fingers with different bees on them, and they're not stinging me for various reasons. The one in the top is a leafcutter bee. She's not stinging me because she doesn't care. The one in the middle is a bumblebee, and they can easily give you a good sting, but that's a male, and male bees and wasps don't have stingers. And then the one in the bottom right is a sweat bee, actually, and she would very much like to sting me, but at that time I was more in the field and I had thicker calluses on my fingers, so she wasn't able to. Now I just sit in front of a computer all day, but she wasn't able to penetrate my skin. So most bees are actually solitary. They don't have queens and workers, and they mostly live in the ground. So about 70% of bees that make nests in the ground. Typically, they're not black and yellow. They don't make honey. Bumblebees make tiny amounts, but most of the species that we have in Canada do not. And most bees, we have pretty good information about, the status of honeybees in Canada. There's people have found evidence of declines in bumblebees, but most of the species that we have, we just don't have any good sense of whether or not bees are doing well or not. But generally, we assume that they're doing poorly because of habitat declines. So this is just a smattering of some of the bees that we have in Manitoba. I would love to spend hours just going over them, all of them with you, but I'll focus on just a couple. So in the upper left is Andrena. These are, we have maybe 40 or 50 species in Manitoba. Mostly they come out early in the spring, and they're, important pollinators of early blooming kind of perennial crops, apples, cherries, blueberries, and that's one sort of visiting a strawberry flower. And then I'll also just sort of refresh us about the one in the bottom center. That's Elasioglossom. These are the sweat bees. And there's maybe about 50 or so species in Manitoba, and incredibly abundant. So if you go out and sort of look, you're unlikely to see very many sweat bees. But if you put out traps specifically to collect bees, they're oftentimes the most abundant bees that you find. So they're really abundant. Some bees are not going to be important pollinators no matter whether or not they're present or not. So the one in the upper left, which is one of the most beautiful bees we have here in Manitoba, this is actually a specialist on dahlia. So it will ignore any other flowering plant in its vicinity. It only wants its specific host plant. And there's a lot of bees that are actually like that. And then in the bottom right is an alfalfa leafcutter bee, which is an important sort of managed pollinator. But we also have about 20 other species of leafcutter bees that are sort of native to the province. And they are also important pollinators of similar crops. And then this is just sort of a smattering of some other sort of bees. And in the center, you have a species that's sort of emerging out of its nest. So that's what you sort of have to look for if you're trying to find a bee nest, is a little head poking out of the ground. And some of the bees here, actually, just out of interest's sake, in the bottom right, the bottom left, these are actually what we call cuckoo bees. So these are bees that don't collect pollen, they don't build nests, they just lay their eggs in the nests of other bees. And there's quite a few bees that do that. There's a number of different managed pollinators that are used in different parts of North America. So of course, there's the honeybee. There is also possible to buy managed commercial bumblebee colonies, which are mostly used in greenhouse sort of operations for things like tomato. The one in the upper right is the blue orchard bee, and that's used as a commercial pollinator in a lot of orchard crops. So they're more effective per visit than a honeybee is in pollinating things like apples and cherries. And again, we have the leafcutter bee in the bottom right. So some of the blue orchard bees and the leafcutter bees are sort of valuable, sort of solitary managed pollinators because they'll occupy just about any sort of pre-existing cavity that you can find. So you can sort of move them around in the same way that you can sort of move honeybee colonies. For a lot of your wild bees, it's much harder to do that because they nest in the ground. So this is an Andrena. This is one of the sort of common spring bees. And she's got a full pollen load, so she's been out foraging on flowers. You can see that sort of yellow on her back legs. And then she's sort of coming into sort of her nest site. She sort of lands, and then she sort of moves a little bit to the left, and then she's gone. And so that's what a bee nest looks like if you're sort of walking by, if you're trying to find a bee nest. So most of us sort of walk by bee nests all the time, and we never see them, but they're there. If you looked inside the nest, so this is sort of a sweat bee on the left and a leafcutter bee on the right. So they just collect some nectar and pollen, mix it into a ball, and lay a single egg. So those are bee eggs. So they don't make honey. They don't have any sort of extra resources. And just for sort of interest, that's what a developing bee looks like. So you get an egg to an early instar and sort of a fully developed larva, and then that's a bee pupa. So bees need habitat, and unfortunately, sometimes that's not very readily available in some of the agricultural areas in Manitoba. So this is just a Google Earth image in the Red River Valley. So there's not a lot of extra resources for bees to use. But sort of natural landscapes actually help support bees, not just in terms of floral resources, but also sort of buffering them against pesticides. So this was a project, actually an apple, that I was involved with some years ago. Sort of the horizontal axis is basically a measure of how much pesticide was being applied in these systems. And then the vertical axis is the amount of natural areas surrounding those orchards. And the top is for just abundance of bees, and the bottom is the different numbers of species that were present. And not surprisingly, if you have a lot of natural area, not many pesticides, you have a lot of bees. And if you have lots of pesticides and not much natural area, you have few bees. That's the bright red. But actually, if you've had a significant amount of pesticide use, but you had natural landscapes next to it, the bees actually did relatively well. And bees are actually susceptible to different classes of pesticides. So they're insects, of course, so insecticides are bad, but they also need flowers. So herbicides can sometimes negatively affect their populations if it's reducing the amount of resources for them. But bees actually also have a lot of sort of symbiotic microorganisms that help them sort of feed on the pollen that they're using. And so actually fungicides are really bad for bees. So this is one of the things that we sort of explored here in Manitoba. This is part of an organic science cluster grant, but basically introducing pollinator-friendly habitat next to sort of farm fields and sort of measuring the effect that has on bees, but also sort of other beneficial insects, predatory ground beetles in particular. And we sort of found a significant sort of immediate sort of increase in those. They are attracted to these sort of habitats, and so they sort of come and they sort of live in these areas. And so we're hoping that this sort of approach can help sort of mitigate some of the habitat loss that we've seen. But the best thing that you can do is basically keep the habitat that you have. So keep any forested areas, shelter belts, whatever might be available. So this is another study that I was involved with in apples again. And basically for this graph, you just need to know that the thick solid arrows are significant interactions, and the reds are negative interactions, and the black are positive interactions. And so basically as the amount of agriculture in the landscape increased, you had this sort of negative effect on the richness of bees, not so much on the abundance of bees. But an interesting thing in terms of increasing the amount of fruit weight, sort of the yield of apples, it wasn't so much the abundance of bees that was present, the numbers of individuals, and it wasn't so much how many species that you had. It was actually how broad, how diverse those species were and sort of the phylogeny. So having a bunch of sweat bees, like 10 sweat bees, is not as good as having a sweat bee, a mason bee, a miner bee, a honeybee, a bumblebee. That sort of phylogenetic diversity was really important for increasing yield. So we want bee diversity sort of generally. My father's actually he's retired. He was a commercial beekeeper in Ontario. So I'm about to sort of kick honeybees a little bit, but I do have a soft spot for them. But honeybees get too much credit for the pollination that happens. So in Canada, this is some data from 2021, I believe, from Ag Canada, that there's about $3 billion worth of pollination value added by honeybees in Canada every year. And about over 200 million of that was due to apple pollination. But a lot of research shows that actually apples don't need honeybees at all. Apples, they need relatively few of their flowers to actually get a full yield, and wild bees are perfectly capable of supplying that. So sometimes people see honeybees, they see yield due to pollination, and they assume the two are tightly linked, but they're not necessarily true. Sometimes honeybees are actually pretty poor pollinators. So they visit flowers in a very different way than some of the wild bees do. And sometimes this results in them being less effective at transferring pollen. This is an example from alfalfa. So the second bar from the top, Apis mellifera, that's your honeybee. And then the second one from the bottom is Megachile rotundata, that's your alfalfa leafcutter bee. And alfalfa has a very specifically shaped flower, and it needs to be tripped in order to sort of make the reproductive parts accessible. And it's kind of like when it opens up, it kind of slams the pollen onto the bee, and honeybees don't like that very much. It's kind of like getting punched in the face. And so honeybees tend to avoid trying to trip the flower. They try to get the nectar, they sort of rob it, they sort of come at it from the side. But alfalfa leafcutter bees, they're robust, they have strong, thick heads. So they don't mind getting in there and tripping those flowers. And so per individual, they're much more effective pollinators than honeybees. And that's actually true for a lot of different crops. So mining bees, Andrina, that I talked about, are more effective at pollinating apples and cherries than honeybees are. So this is a global data set that came out about a decade ago, looking at the number of visitors to crop flowers across the globe. So sort of separating them between honeybees and wild insects. And basically it really depends on where you are, what crop you're using, what part of the world you're at, is how relevant honeybees are to your crop. You'll see there's pretty much nothing going on in Canada. We know relatively little about the crops in the prairies for this kind of work. But generally speaking, there's a lot of wild insects that are out there doing the pollination service. The same study sort of showed that across a bunch of different crops globally, that the amount of fruit set that you saw in these crops consistently increased, so above that 0 dashed line, due to the presence of wild insects. But the honeybees were relatively unimportant. So only 14% of the crops that they studied actually reliably had benefits due to honeybee presence. So wild pollinators are generally, globally at least, more important than honeybees. One of the things that pollination biologists do oftentimes is these pollination experiments. So oftentimes they exclude pollinators by bagging flowers. So that's the one that, this is a blueberry example. So that's on the left. And in the center is sort of your sort of control, your flowers are available to pollinators, and you get sort of blueberries as a result. And the other thing that pollination biologists sometimes do is add additional pollen to those flowers manually to try to see whether or not there's a deficit between what the native sort of pollinators provide and what could potentially be obtained if you had maximal pollination. So I show this just to sort of help you understand some of these graphs I'm going to show. This is from sunflowers in sort of North Dakota. Each of these sort of pairs of bars are different different varieties of sunflowers, and sort of showing the seed mass per flower head with flowers that had pollinators excluded versus pollinators available. And so there's pretty obvious that most of these varieties, pollinators provided a significant sort of increase in the amount of seed mass per flower head. Sunflower is actually an interesting plant from sort of a bee taxonomist's perspective because it's a native species. There's actually a huge variety of bees that have sort of become adapted to using sunflowers. So these are just a couple of examples. There are many more of bees that are specialists on sunflowers. They only visit sunflowers. So it's an interesting crop for bees. This is some data from sort of brassica, sort of oilseed production. This is actually coming from Europe. But the same sort of experimental setup. So they have the left, the dark bar is pollinator excluded. Then in the middle, they have these sort of supplemented flowers. And then the gray bar is just sort of available to bees. And on the edges of fields, they sort of saw this sort of big, particularly this big increase in the number of seeds per flower head when bees were sort of available. So there's sort of pollen limitation present. You could get more yield if you had more pollination in this example. And sort of a similar sort of result was found for seed weight, depending on whether or not it was planted in the spring or the winter in these sort of two examples. So there's yield to be gained if pollination is available. Whoops, I'm sort of jumping too far. There is sort of a caveat to some of these sort of pollination experiments, in that they oftentimes don't necessarily account for the fact that plants are able to dedicate resources to where they need them. So you might exclude pollinators from one group of flowers and yield goes down, but they may be able to redistribute their resources. And in the research that I did when I was in Michigan with blueberries, the lesson I sort of learned was that it really depends on how well the crop is doing. So if you have a severe drought or if you have severe disease, if there's something else that's going to be limiting the yield of your plant, no amount of bees is going to recover from that. So it's only when the plants have the resources that they need that they can sort of dedicate that to more yield, then bees have the potential to sort of benefit them. And this is sort of a very recent paper that I was not involved with, but it came out this year, and this is looking at canola. And they were looking at sort of the differences between different groups of managed bees. So honeybees, which is the orange kind of yellow line, and then the leafcutter bees, which is in green. And so there's sort of different distribution of how these bees visited the crop. So honeybees were a little bit more spread out through the field, whereas the leafcutter bees tended to be a little bit more closely connected to their leafcutter homes that were sort of built. So they don't forage very far from where their nests are. And that sort of what's shown in the middle. So the distance from the leafcutter bee shelter, it declines quite rapidly. So they don't like to forage very far. They don't have the same sort of recruitment that honeybees do. They don't dance to sort of bring in more resources, more individuals. But what they did find in the study was that honeybees didn't have an effect on the pollination of the seed canola, but leafcutter bees did. So again, leafcutter bees are sometimes more effective pollinators than honeybees. But overall, in sort of non-seed canola, they didn't see a strong effect. It was really just had to do with the quality of the plant that was important. So I just want to summarize a few things. So the wild pollinators are generally underappreciated. They're actually doing a lot more pollination service than people give them credit to. Usually sort of just assume that it's the honeybees that are doing it. That's not always true. They contribute to pollination, they contribute to yield. But in the specific case of Manitoba, I think it's probably relatively limited because a lot of the crops that we grow are going to be able to sort of self-pollinate. And there may be other things that are sort of affecting yield besides just a lack of pollination. But it depends a lot on the specific crop that you're interested in, and it depends on sort of the broader sort of landscape context. So if you have enough natural habitat that there are going to be bees present, then you can sort of potentially get benefits. So we need those habitats or sort of ways of sort of introducing these sort of enhanced flowering habitats to support pollinators, and also a lot of other beneficial insects. So these sort of flowering plants support all the parasitoids that control pest populations and predators and things like that as well. And I think that's it for me.
Hi. Being a plant pathologist myself, I'm interested in your comment that fungicides may be very detrimental to pollinators because of the symbiotes in their gut. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, so that's a lot of research that sort of come out recently. So the paper I talked about, that was one of the most important factors that they found was that it was actually fungicides that were more important than some of the other pesticides that were used. And more recent research where people have sort of dug up bee nests and sort of looked at the actual pollen balls that they have in those nests, there's actually all these sort of fungal kind of microbes that live that the bees sort of was not quite sure where they sort of get them from, if they're getting them from the wilds, and then sort of, but they become sort of part of that pollen mass, and they actually help digest the pollen that makes it more available for the larva to sort of consume. So the bees themselves are actually probably getting some nutrients from the fungus itself, not just the pollen. So they're probably not really herbivores, they're kind of omnivores. And so, yeah, so whenever they're exposed to fungicides and they bring those back to their nests, they're sort of killing the thought is that it's killing those fungi, and then that's decreasing the nutritional quality of their food.
We've got a question here.
Yeah, my question is sort of similar. Like you see kind of beehives being put in canola fields. Should we be concerned at all about those bees being put at a canola field if that canola field gets sprayed for a fungicide?
Generally speaking, I don't worry too much about honeybees. Honeybee colonies are actually fairly stable. There's much worse things that honeybees face than fungicides. But yeah, no, it's it's about all bad. I mean, from the bees perspective, pesticides are all bad. But obviously, people have been using fungicides for years and other pesticides, and we still have honeybees. So it's not overnight going to wipe them out, but is probably at some level helping, just to kind of make life harder for bees.
Okay, there's another question right here, and then Vikram, if we've got time.
Can we hear your ideas on how to increase the natural and enhanced habitats?
Yeah. So, I mean, natural habitats basically don't cut it down. So if you have a shelter belt, try to keep it. It would be the best thing to do is nothing at all. But the floral resources, and putting in habitats, if you have, marginal lands that's not as productive, or sort of a grassy margin that maybe you don't need to be driving on all the time. Those would be areas I would focus on. We did some work with Imperial Seeds. They help sort of provide some of the resources. So, in an ideal world, I would plant it all in, native prairie perennial flowers, but that seed is very expensive. So we were testing sort of a variety of annuals, tame perennials to make a cheaper seed mix. Just flowering things that would sort of flower at different times of the year and make those available for bees. I mean, I think if you're hoping that I would be surprised if it made economic sense to do it, in terms of, in the short term, you'd see a return on the cost of the seed and the loss of the land. But I think from a sustainability, we haven't measured all the potential benefits. So it might have potential benefits for carbon sequestration, for soil quality, soil erosion, like water quality, runoff, and all the natural enemies and bees. But we haven't no one's done a full economic analysis on that. But I would imagine it would probably be, you don't want to do it in the hopes that you're going to get this dramatic increase in yield. You're doing it for other sort of ethical and moral reasons, probably.
Hi, my name is Vikram Bisht from Manitoba Agriculture. Do you have any comments on the use of bees or honeybees for disseminating biological control products?
Oh yeah, I mean, this is some work that some people I know out of Guelph did. Peter Kevin was one of the people who was related to some of that work. But yeah, I guess the idea is, you could put, bees, you can potentially have products, whether or not it's a fungicide or whatever it might be. If you have anything that's kind of in a powder form, especially if you have it at the hive, and so that the bees, as they're leaving the hive, pick it up on their bodies, then they go and visit a bunch of flowers, and then they distribute those biological controls to the plants. So that's a thing that people have experimented with. How effective it is, I'd have to look up some of the research. I don't have that on the top of my head, but it is something that people have explored, and I don't see why it wouldn't work. I mean, if you wanted to get something to a flower, and it was in a kind of a powdery form that would stick to a bee's body, as long as it's not so bothersome that the bees just immediately clean themselves off as soon as they might do that first. They land on a leaf, clean themselves off, and then fly to the flower. So that would probably reduce it, but that's a risk. But yeah, I don't have the results from those studies in my brain to tell you how effective it was.